Adding contrast in DaVinci Resolve is one of the most fundamental things we can do in color grading, and it can really just make your image start to really pop out of the screen a little bit and look a bit less boring. When we talk about contrast, we're basically talking about the difference between a dark part of the image and a bright part of the image. And if we're talking about contrast for the overall image or video, we're talking about the difference between the darkest point on the screen and the brightest point on the screen. If we've only got a low contrast image, the difference between those 2 points is going to be smaller, and if we've got a high contrast image, the difference between those 2 points is going to be bigger. Let me head into Resolve and I'll show you what I mean. We'll open the scopes by clicking this button, and then we'll click the drop down and change the scope type to waveform so we can see the difference in bright areas at the top and dark areas at the bottom of this scope. We're in the primaries color wheels and we've got this contrast control. We can hold down the left mouse button over the word contrast and move it right to increase the contrast in the image. Watch what's happening. The contrast is getting gradually more and more until we go completely over the top. Double click to reset. I'll do that again. This time watch what's happening in the scope. The darker point is moving down and the brighter points are moving up to increase that distance between bright and dark or increase the contrast. If I double click and hold the left mouse button down and go the other way, move the mouse to the left, we're going to decrease the contrast. The difference between the bright and dark points are getting closer together, or the difference is getting smaller, and in the image you can see we're losing contrast. I'm going to double click to reset that, and I want to switch over to this image, which is just a simple grayscale gradient. We'll alter the contrast as we did before. We'll start to increase the contrast. Watch what's happening in this gradient. You can see that dark point is slowly creeping up to the middle, and the white is creeping from the right to the left. We're getting super high contrast now, and if we keep going, we've got a massively contrast image where we've literally just got black and white. Just double click to reset that. Also watch what's happening in the scope down here. As I'm increasing the contrast, it's pushing those darker areas down and it's pushing those brighter areas up to try and increase the difference in contrast, or increase the difference between the dark and light points. And you can see we've got an S shape down here, and this is a classic indication of contrast being added, moving those brighter areas up and those darker areas down. Just double click to reset that and head back to this image. So that's the first method, using the contrast control in the primaries palette. Let me show you the second method, and that's to switch over to the HDR palette and use the contrast control in this palette instead. As before, we'll hold down the left mouse button, move the mouse to the right, and start to increase the contrast. First of all, notice what's happening in the scopes. We're pushing the brighter areas up and the darker areas down, so that's increasing the contrast. But there is a difference here between the previous version. When you use the contrast control in the HDR palette, it's not going to change the saturation. If you look at my t-shirt and these green bushes, the saturation is not changing, and that's because of the way the HDR palette works. The HDR palette operates in a more photometric way, or a way that matches up to how humans perceive light. And one way you can think of using contrast in the HDR palette is increasing the contrast in a more clinical way in terms of changes to saturation. The contrast control here is working with the luminance values or the brightness values, and it's not affecting the saturation. I'll just reset this whole thing, switch back to the primaries, and I'm going to increase the contrast, and just keep an eye on what's happening in these green bushes. As I increase the contrast, they start to look more saturated. You can see how the green is looking more saturated, and if I reset that, the greens look a bit less saturated. And that's one of the main differences between using the HDR contrast control. But of course, if you do use the HDR control to add some contrast, you can then go and add in some global saturation with this control to get things looking how you want. Just going to reset all of that and switch back to this. Here's our grayscale, and in the HDR contrast control, we'll go and increase the contrast. You can see in this version, the black point is still being pinned in place and we're getting a curve in the blacks, but the white point is moving across. We don't have that curve at the top of the white point when we're using the HDR control. For contrast, double click to reset that. Along with the contrast control, we'll just switch back to the primaries. We've got this pivot control. The pivot adjusts the point at which the dark and light points get moved around or moved up and down. The easiest way to show you this is on this grayscale image. I'm going to increase the contrast, and you can see we've got this S curve in the scopes. If I change the pivot once again by holding down the left button and moving the mouse to the left, first of all, watch what's happening in the scopes. It's moving the point at which that curve takes effect. If I move the pivot this way, it's going to affect more of the brighter areas in terms of that curve or where that curve happens. And if we move the pivot down, it's going to move into the darker areas. Double click to reset that. So you can use the pivot to really fine tune how that contrast is applied and how the contrast is affecting the brighter areas or the darker areas of the image. So that's the second version using the HDR contrast control. Let's take a look at the third way to add contrast to an image, and that's to use the curves. You can see we've got all of these controls in this section, but this section is the curves. And within this section, we've got a lot of different types of curves. For the purposes of this video, we want to click on this custom one. By default, this is going to affect the brightness information and also all of the color information. And you can see we can select individual color channels, but we want to work with everything. So to create contrast, we can click our mouse button on this line and pull this down, and we can click up here, create another control point and move this up. And you can see in the scopes, we're creating that familiar S shape now. The benefit of using the curves is that we can have so much more control over the shape of this contrast curve to really fine tune where the contrast occurs. We can even add additional control points. Say we want to pull down the mid brightness of the image, but still create some contrast. We'll have maximum control over how this contrast is applied now. But of course, with maximum control comes a lot of responsibility. So using curves might make it easier to get to an image that doesn't quite look right, especially if you're starting out. But as you start to get more confident with contrast, you definitely want to check out this third method sometimes and see if it offers a better result than using the other contrast methods. Another way you can affect the contrast and the brightness of the image in different areas is to use the HDR controls, and that's exactly what you'll learn about if you watch this video next. I'm Jason Roberts, this is DaVinci Dojo, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.